So the two men know each other pretty well. I don't think there's a terrible lot of love lost there at this point.
Undoubtedly, one of the pictures of the day in the Times is of the hollowed out shell of an Iranian ballistic missile. It was one of 120 fired towards Israel on Saturday. The picture shows a colossal tube of metal and is thought to be able to carry a warhead the size of a car. It makes Iran's claims that their attack was token seem absurd. So what happens now? David Cameron is meeting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to urge him not to retaliate. Let's get the details from Arieh Kovler, a writer and analyst in Jerusalem. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do we think the current thinking is of Benjamin Netanyahu? Is it still, we're going to talk tough and we're going to retaliate and Iran are really going to regret this? Or are they looking at more nuanced, more targeted ways of fighting back?
I think it's really a very complicated and tough decision for the Israeli government. After an attack the size and scale of Iran's barrage, we're talking 300 projectiles, and that large ballistic missile you saw, I think more over 100 of those directed towards Israel. There is a sense that you can't let this kind of thing pass in a region like the Middle East. If you do, it sends a message to all the countries around, many of whom are also trying to fire rockets and missiles at us here, that this kind of thing you can get away with. And so there is pretty much consensus there needs to be an Israeli response, and it needs to be a response that's more than symbolic. The challenge is finding something that is more than symbolic that also doesn't escalate things into a wider regional war. There is a sense that perhaps Israel will divide its response between Iranian territory proper and between Iranian proxies in places like Iraq, and that might kind of soften the blow, politically speaking. But nobody really knows. Even the Americans don't know at this point. And those people around the Israeli decision-making on this are really keeping tight-lipped so as not to tip off the Iranians and perhaps not to be talked out of it by any allies.
America is saying that they believe Israel is planning a narrow and limited strike inside Iran. So we'll have to wait and see. There's no point really, I suppose, speculating on what that might be. What about this meeting then between Benjamin Netanyahu and David Cameron? Do we know what Benjamin Netanyahu thinks of David Cameron, given his kind of past remarks about Gaza?
Well, remember, Netanyahu has been Prime Minister of Israel, apart from a brief break a couple of years ago, since 2009, and was PM the entire time when Cameron was PM of the UK. So the two men know each other pretty well. I don't think there's a terrible lot of love lost there at this point. David Cameron was always more robust on issues like Gaza as Prime Minister than perhaps sometimes we remember, while also still being obviously a supporter of Israel more broadly. This is a meeting, I think, it's partly about buying time. Simply by David Cameron being in Israel, it means that Israel is less likely to strike Iran in the next day or so while he's here. At the same time, there's also lots of issues still around, obviously, the Gaza war. What happens next on that? What happens with the possible planned invasion of Rafah? And one of the British government's main aims right now is to try and increase the amount of aid going into Gaza, and then once it goes in, critically reaching Gazans. The problem is less being the aid getting into Gaza than it is getting to the people that need it.
Yes.
So those are probably the topics of conversation.
Yeah. And we should also mention the killing of the Hezbollah general yesterday. What can you tell us about that, and what difference does that make?
The war has got less coverage overall, but for Israelis, the war in the north is more of a day-to-day issue for them than the war now in Gaza. Some 100,000 Israelis, something like that, are still not back in their homes in the north of Israel. It's been evacuated for months, and they're living in hotels, unable to return home. And every day there's a very significant amount of conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. Rockets going both ways, drones entering Israel, assassinations of Hezbollah figures. This is a slightly bigger one, but the temperature has been kind of raising consistently but slowly in the north now for months. And it's unclear that this one thing will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. That said, Hezbollah has very significant rocket capabilities. And even, in 2006, when Hezbollah chose to go to war with Israel, they were able to launch rockets on most of the country. So there is an element of restraint on both sides still there.
I just wanted to ask about the level of continued protests in Israel about what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing, what the government is doing, and release the hostages, bring them back now. That seems to happen with a deal of regularity. How often does it happen? Are the numbers pretty static? And when people call for the hostages to come back, is that hand in hand with a ceasefire?
So the numbers were getting extremely high, beginning to rival the numbers of the anti-government protests before the war. This strike by Iran has dulled the protests a fair bit, and we'll have to see how it impacts it over the coming weeks. When people call for the hostages to return, they are normally calling essentially for the Israeli government to be willing to do painful deals in order to return them. Whether that means the release of a number of Palestinian security prisoners, including murderers and terrorists, whether that means quite a long ceasefire in Gaza, whether that means a permanent one. Everyone in that protest will have a different sense of what they mean. Almost all Israelis, including those on the centre-right, accept that as part of a hostage deal, there'll be at least a short to medium-term ceasefire. Where things have broken down in the talks with Hamas and Israel is that Hamas's position is, unless Israel gives up its war on Hamas and allows them to stay in power, they're not prepared to release a single hostage. And I think for many Israelis, even some of those who are on the anti-government protests, they feel like that's a step too far. They're not willing to leave Hamas in power in Gaza to maybe do this again, really at any price.
Arieh, that's very clear. Thank you very much. Arieh Kovler, a writer and analyst in Jerusalem.
The US has announced it will impose new sanctions against Iran, including its missile and drone program, following its attack on Israel at the weekend. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, will meet Benjamin Netanyahu on a visit to Israel today. Rishi Sunak has already told the Israeli Prime Minister in a phone call that calm heads should prevail when responding to Iran's aerial bombardment. We can cross now live to Israel and speak to Zach Anders, a journalist in Tel Aviv. Morning, Zach.
Hi, good morning.
Just on these new US sanctions, is this almost a signal from America to Israel that the response to the weekend's attack should be diplomatic rather than military?
I think so. And one of the remarkable things about the last 24 or 48 hours has been watching the entire region come together against an Israeli retaliatory action. You've got Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the U.S., of course, all saying, let's let this be. Everyone back to their corners and try and find a way to just move forward. The Israelis, they obviously, this is a moment that is so far beyond the line. You've got, yesterday they're showing off the bits of the ballistic missiles, these massive hulking metal behemoths that they're showing off at military bases to the press and saying, we can't let this stand. This could hold a nuclear warhead. We have to respond. So the U.S. certainly wants this to be the end, but Israel's saying, no, we're going to have to strike targets in Iran.
That's interesting. I mean, what is the latest mood music on that front in Israel? I mean, are they still very much of the, no, we need to have a military retaliation here?
Yeah, 100%. And it's been, we're seeing the war cabinet and the prime minister kind of, it seems like, isolate themselves. They've very few public engagements. They keep going back into these closed sessions. We're not getting any serious updates or substantial updates, I should say. That said, the Knesset and the essentially the MPs are all beating the war drums. You've got voices from up and down the political roster inside Israel that are calling for a serious retaliation against Iran. Remember, the Israelis were the one that struck this consulate in Syria that started all this with Iran, but the Israelis are saying, this has crossed a line. The amount of firepower that Iran launched over the weekend on Saturday at Israeli territory from their own territory is something that they want to make sure has some sort of response that they think, let's put ourselves into a situation where Iran won't do this again, but the fear here is that this is just going to continue to escalate, be a back and forth.
Does Israel want escalation? I mean, does it almost see, if there was a more direct conflict with Iran that ended up having to drag in the US, is that almost what some in Israel actually want to see?
Well, I think if you looked at it as who has more to lose, it's certainly Iran, who is still trying to put its nuclear program on the right footing. If the Israelis get a green light and essentially, they've got the region, no one's going to stop them here, not the U.S., not the U.K., and they have the green light to strike the nuclear targets. The Israelis certainly have wanted to do that for years and years, and the U.S. Probably has a vested interest in that happening as well. I think when Western leaders talk about proportionality in these retaliatory strikes, then certainly on that target list would be the Shahed drone manufacturing facilities. And to be honest, if that first wave of the attack on Saturday was those Shahed drones, if you were to look at it from what's going to save the most civilian life going forward, the remarkable thing is if Israel was to strike those and undercut Iran's Shahed drone productions, that would be saving countless lives in Ukraine.
Yeah,
I've spent a lot of time covering that war as well. And those Shahed drones, Israel's got the incredible air defense system that shoots all of this down, the drones, the ballistics. Ukraine doesn't. And those Shahed drones are killing civilians on a near daily basis over there. Russia buys those drones with impunity and ships them, Iran ships them by the hundreds, thousands.
that's a really good point you raised there, Zach, about the Shahed drones. Although, I'm right in saying they're now actually starting to produce them in Russia as well now.
Yeah, it's cheap technology too. What's remarkable about those Shahed drones is that they're basically strapped onto a lawnmower motor that you can buy on Alibaba. You can get some of these parts online. There's nothing too unique about the way they're produced.
Yeah, apparently it's $20,000 per drone, which is quite something. Just finally, Zach, David Cameron, UK Foreign Secretary, of course, is going to be in Israel today meeting Benjamin Netanyahu. How do you think that meeting will go? Because they've never had the best of relations, dating back to when Cameron was UK Prime Minister.
Well, I would imagine it's going to be the same exact thing that the U.S. has been telling the Prime Minister, which is this situation has the possibility to escalate into a full-on conflict with Iran, that in that situation no one wins, no one has a vested interest. Even if you want to strike some of these sites and eliminate the nuclear threat from Iran, is that really worth direct confrontation with a power in the region that has thousands of these ballistic missiles? You saw 100 of them over the weekend, and you shot them down, but it wasn't a guarantee, and it was kind of a nerve-wracking night. And you now see what those things look like. Those were not the ones that were strapped with, from what we can tell, the ones that hit the bases weren't strapped with the most explosive ordnance or the most powerful payload it could have had. So Iran somewhat held back, and if they chose to launch as many as they could to overwhelm what's called a saturation attack, just overwhelm the air defenses, they could. And then you've really got ourselves into a hot war between two major military powers in the Middle East. No one wants to see that.
Zach, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
Zach Anders there, a journalist in Tel Aviv.